In 1986 and 1987, my grandma turned me on to this book. Dr. George Ritchie, Return from Tomorrow. And this book profoundly moved me, touched me, made me a better person. Before I read this book, I didn't care about the love of God, the love of Jesus. I just wanted to go to heaven, get out and go to hell. But when I read this book, a chord was struck in me about Jesus loved me, and that became a most important thing in my life. The most important thing, that Jesus loved me. The most, sure I had my idols, but the most important thing to me was that Jesus loved me unconditionally. Oh my goodness. And I knew this was Jesus because what's written on this page right here. I had my doubts, because it didn't. This book didn't fit the theology. The fundamentals of this theology to a T. But this sentence, these two sentences, assure me that this was the true Jesus. And that Jesus truly loved me. Okay. If I can find... Yeah, it's coming. Page 55. During his near-death experience, George Ritchie writes this. Jesus says to him, "What have you done with your life to show me? Already I understood that in my first frantic efforts to come up with an impressive answer, I had missed the point altogether. He wasn't asking about accomplishments and rewards. The question, like everything else proceeding from him, had to do with love. How much have you loved your life? Have you loved others as I am loving you, totally, unconditionally?" Wow, man, I love that. Hearing the question like that, I saw how foolish it was even to try to find an answer in the scenes around us. Why, I had not known love that this was possible. Someone should have told me, I thought indignantly. I found out to discover what life was all about. Like coming to a final exam and discovering you were going to be tested on a subject you had never studied. If this was the point in everything, why hadn't someone told me? Though these thoughts rose out of self-pity and self-excuse, the answering thought from Jesus held no rebuke, only that hint of heavenly laughter behind the words. "I did tell you." But how? Still wanting to justify myself. How could he have told me and I not heard? This next lines made this book for me. Okay. "I told you by the life I lived. I told you by the death I died. And if you keep your eyes on me, you will see more." Now, why was this so important? Hold on. Why was this so important? Because in the near-death experience, the light never identifies himself. People just identify the light. But in this near-death experience, the light is saying, "I died for you." Who else died for us but Jesus? But listen to this testimony. Listen, and I had a crisis. Do I believe in the story right now? Hell no. It's all a crock of shit. And I just watched this damn video and you'll see why. Let me get out of the way and introduce to you Dr. George Ritchie III.
Tell this in 3 parts. Being a doctor, tell this to give some idea of the medical background, so you know what I was faced with before. Then I'll tell you what I experienced from the subjective point of view. And then the third In 1943, just having met a wonderful young couple here from the University of Richmond, I was out at the University of Richmond. This had gone out there in 41. A fellow by the name of Hitler came along and changed my schedule. So I was rushing up and took 3.5 years of college in 2 years because my father, of all things, who was too old to be drafted, was called into service in charge of the storage and fuel for the D-Day leave. And then when I heard he definitely was going overseas, I volunteered from inactive reserve to active duty. And as I've often laughed and said, since it's the only place on earth I've ever found where I can march my body up to my knees and still have dust going in my face when I'm talking about the Panhandle of Texas. With all due respect to the Texans here. I had completed basic, or just about completed basic. One day got called up to appear before the commander of the company, told to go back and get in dress uniform. I was going to have to go to battalion headquarters. Young people out again, they had some very serious misgivings. It isn't very often that a private is told to get in dress uniform and go to the battalion headquarters unless there's a court-martial. When I got there, my worst fears were confirmed. I had never seen as much brass in one place since I had come into the Army. Told to have a seat. They called for me in a few minutes. Then they told me I could go on in. When I went in there, here was a 2-star general, the most I had seen, sitting there at the desk, and I snapped to attention. In fact, I think I had the most rigid attention you've ever seen. Finally said at ease. And then began to throw all kinds of questions, I think, about everything that's ever happened to me, and then told me that I was to report back the next afternoon at 2 o'clock. I still couldn't find out exactly what was going on. At least I got the impression I wasn't being court-martialed. Or if I was, it was going to be a doozy because this was going to be a general. They didn't have that high a brass on a special assignment. Went back and was told that I had been picked of all things by the Army Special Army Training Program to be sent back to study medicine, and I was being assigned to the Medical College of Virginia. And if you ever heard of a young man thinking he had to worry about the tail, I thought I had. My medical education was going to be paid for by Uncle Sam, and I was going to be billeted at my own home, all expense paid, and I was going to be a full-fledged MD by the time I was 23 years of age. I really thought that I had to worry about the tail. Like most young people, I think this happens to. By the time I was 30, I was going to have 2 cats in the garage, and I'm not talking about the feline variety. Going to have a cottage at the beach. I wanted to help my fellow even bit, but I had some very definite goals. Now, as Bob Burns at Great Scottish Sport said, man proposes and God disposes. I don't think I can blame this on God. About 3 weeks later, a young save-tail lieutenant sent my entire battalion, which I was, at detention at 5 above 0. And he put 90% of my battalion into the hospital with what was known as an upper respiratory infection. I was about to have a fit because I knew that I had to start medicine. It was going to be sometime just before Christmas. And this was right after Thanksgiving. A week later, I really felt miserable. Went over to the dispensary and found out what was wrong. They took my temperature, sent me to the hospital. I was in the hospital for a week, and if ever you ever heard of a private trying to press a bunch of doctors and nurses to decisions, I was him. Finally talked them into sending me to the recuperation ward on the morning of the 19th of December. Because by that time I had seen my orders, I was due to report to the commandant at the Medical College of Virginia on the 22nd of December at 2:30 in the afternoon. This was a recuperation. I've really never met such wonderful people. They made arrangements for the Jeep to pick me up the next morning at approximately 1 o'clock. I was aboard the train at 2:20 a.m. there in Abilene, and then on into Richmond. Never will forget, that evening, a buddy I had met there in recuperation ward asked me if I would be interested in going to see the show with him in the hospital. Now this was 1943 were the great big station hospitals. To give you some idea, that particular night, I would say conservatively, there were over 5,000 patients in the hospital. You can't put 5,000 patients in the University of Virginia, the Medical College of Virginia, and Norfolk all combined. So you have some idea of one of them. That the entire these old hospitals were spread out. So we went to see the show, which had a theater right in the hospital itself. I told them we could go if I could get back early because I knew I had to catch, would be picked up by the Jeep at about 1 o'clock or 5 after 1. So we went to the 7 o'clock show. I came back and I felt pretty hot. I had completed basic training, was also certified as a medical and surgical tech. And I knew that the best way to reduce temperature was to take aspirin and what we call ABCs. So I went in and asked the ward boy for 6 aspirin tablets and 3 ABCs, 2 aspirin, ABC, found in the bed, and went to sleep. At 12 o'clock, I awakened and I was burning up. Climbed back into the bed and went back to sleep. I said, 1 o'clock was 3 o'clock. At 2 o'clock, I awakened again and I was on fire. Took my last 2 aspirin and ABC and tried to go back to sleep and couldn't. And I said, one reason I couldn't go back to sleep because I was coughing up so much material and spitting in the sputum cup. Now I was in a ward where you have square beds and one type of hell, and did not want to turn on the light until it was time to go because the nurse had let me her alarm clock to go off. So then I was sitting there sweating, could I get on the train? Somehow I had the idea if I could get on the train, that they wouldn't throw me off, and if the train went to Richmond, if I ever got to Richmond, I could get into the medical college, and if I collapsed in front of the medical college, they wouldn't kick me out of medical. See, my thinking was getting a little thick. So, things were just getting steadily worse. So finally, in desperation, to see what time it was, I turned on the light. Sure enough, it was about 10 minutes to 3 or 10 minutes before the alarm went to go off. And I looked down into the sputum cup to see why I'd been coughing up so much material and got the shock of my light. That sputum cup was full of white blood. That really scared me to death. Of course, I played it. I went in and asked the ward boy for a thermometer, took my own temperature, and when I took it out of my mouth, I don't know which one of us were in the greatest state of shock, he or myself. The temperature actually registered 106 and a half. Went in the system telling him about the squeal on it, because before I could say anything, he went out, the nurse wasn't in the ward right at the time to get the nurse. She came back in, got another thermometer, took it down, put it in my mouth. She took it out about minutes later. She didn't say anything at all. She just told the ward boy to get the medical officer in charge. He came, never even bothered to take my temperature again, put a stethoscope on my chest. Call the ambulance immediately. We're sending him over to the X-ray section. And I thought to myself, what's wrong with this guy? He doesn't know it, but I've got to be on the train here. And 25 seconds, I'm talking about sending him to X-ray. You know, we have a name for this. Psychiatry. Just like you're accessory talking about massive denial. We call it projection. It's like when I pointed to him and said, the trouble with him is, and you know, I have 3 fingers pointing back at me. But that's the time I wasn't a psychiatrist. So, the last thing I remember from a human point of view was the captain and actually the doctor there saying, did I think I could stand up long enough to get a picture of my chest? And I really thought this guy there was just too easy. I remember hearing that machine make that peculiar little whirl and then a click, and that's the last thing I remember. And I was told that I collapsed in a heap at the base of that machine. Now, young people, when this thing happened, I was 6 feet 2. I weighed 178 pounds. Wait, it's like a bit more than that, maybe. See, all this professional dignity. But I really didn't have any fat. I had been a long distance runner in college, had just finished basic, and I was pretty much. Approximately 2 weeks later, when they put me on the scale, because they told me that when my weight got up to 135 pounds, and they had saved my seat for me at the medical college, and when my weight got to 135 pounds, they put me on the train and sent me to Richmond. Now, finish to really get me ready for the ball, and he claims he saw something move. So he goes and gets this medical officer again. Now this I know nothing about, or this I've been told by now. The medical officer comes back the second time and tells him, no, he did not see anything move, and I'm just as dead this time as I was the first. But again, he did check me completely off.
Okay, I have to interrupt this. This is another thing that shook my faith that this man's near-death experience was real. In the book, Return from Tomorrow, he relates when the Christ brought him back to his body, and I actually saw him. He actually entered into his body, and when he entered into his body, all of a sudden, there's something in front of his face. His mind began to blur. Lifting his arms was like trying to lift lead bars. At last, he closed his fingers one upon another and started twisting his Pi Gamma Delta ring as blackness closed over him. And the ward boy coming back saw him and thought, surely that hand has moved. Not is moving, has moved. Meaning George Ritchie was truly dead for at least 9 minutes. But if his hand was moving, does that mean he was not really dead, but he was in and out of consciousness? That's what bothers me about this one. In the book, let me see if I can find it. Let me see, so I can read it to you firsthand. Okay. Man, I need. Okay. Here's a story as a recording Return from Tomorrow. After I collapsed in front of the X-ray machine, I learned I had been taken to a small isolation room in a nearby ward where my condition was diagnosed as double lobar pneumonia. Over the next 4 hours, in spite of all the hospital could do, in 1943, miracle drugs, quote unquote, were still in their infancy. My condition deteriorated. I hate this freaking stroke. Early in the morning of December 21st, 24 hours after I had been carried unconscious to the little room, the ward boy, making his regular rounds to hand out medications, arrived at my little cubicle and failed to find the pulse. He checked my respiration rate, none. Next he took my blood pressure, again none, at which point he went running for the officer on duty. The OD arrived on the double and reran the test himself with the same results. At last he straightened up. He's dead all right, he told the ward boy. When you finish your rounds, get him ready for the morgue. The ward boy too continued on these rounds. I skipped the paragraph because it has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, and that must have been the point at which I, in my desperate, disembodied search, arrived back in my little room and saw a figure covered with a sheet. The near-death experience I was recording Return from Tomorrow. When George Ritchie first dies, he jumps out of his bed and turns around and sees a body in the bed with short brown hair, lying very still. And he goes on his adventure, and when he comes back, he sees a figure covered with a sheet. So this means, although there's no time in near-death experiences, time on Earth was actually transpiring. He was dead for at least 9 minutes. Okay, let me find. This is what happened in his near-death experience when it began in Return from Tomorrow. I sat up with a start. What time was it? I looked at the bedside table, but they'd taken away my But they taken the clock away. In fact, where was any of my stuff? The train schedules, my watch. I looked around. I was in a tiny little room I'd never seen before. By the glow of the nightlight, I could see this one bed practically filled it. There was a white wooden chair by the doorway, the bed, the table, and that was all. Where was I, and how had I gotten there? I thought back, trying to remember the X-ray machine. That's right. They take me to the X-ray department, and I must have fainted or something. The train, I missed the train. I jumped out of a bed. Son of a... This, man, you see, not really pissing me off. Let me finish reading. The train, I missed the train. I jumped out of bed in alarm, looking for my clothes, but the X-ray people didn't know, of course, about the train. That's why they had put me here, and instead of sending me back to where the Jeep was waiting. My uniform wasn't on the table. I looked beneath it, behind it, no duffel bag either. Where else in this little closet of a room could they have put them? Under the bed, maybe? I turned around and froze. Someone was lying in that bed. Of course, that was his dead body. He didn't know it. I took one step closer. He was quite a young man with short brown hair, lying very still, but the thing was impossible. I myself had just gotten out of that bed. For a moment, I wrestled with the mystery of it. It was too strange to think about, and anyway, I didn't have time. When he comes back, he goes right... Okay. When he comes back... This is what... When he comes back to his body again, this is what he sees. In one little cubicle, a young man was crying, homesick. Maybe a lot of us cried when we thought no one was watching us, especially now around Christmas time. In the next cubicle, no one. Bed stripped of sheets. In the next one, I drew back startled. There was someone in my bed, all right, but the sheet had been pulled all the way up over his head. Remember, when he first died and saw his body, he saw his brown hair. He saw his face, his brown hair. But now he sees a figure covered by a sheet, leaving only his arms outside the blankets. Strangely rigid and straight those arms looked. Unnatural. Hands turned palm downward. On the third finger of the left hand was a small gold owl over a black onyx. Slowly I crept forward, eyes riveted on that hand. There was something terrible about it. Even in the dim light, I could see that it was too white, too smooth. Where had I seen the hand like that before? Then I remembered Papa Dabley lying dead in the parlor at my side. I backed toward the doorway. The man in that bed was dead. I felt the same reluctance I had the previous time at being in the room with the dead person. But if that was my ring, then it was me, the separated part of me lying under the sheet. Did that mean I was... It was the first time in this entire experience that the word death occurred to me in connection with what was happening. So, this book adds George Ritchie's near-death experience in this book is larger than life. It's realer than real. It's real. Time while he's dead. And when he was dead, he reports there's no time. But time was transpiring, indeed, back in the realm of the living. I was particularly impressed with the fact that when he first came out of his body after dying, he saw his face and hair, brown hair. But when he came back, he left to try to go to Richmond, but when he came back, he saw his body was covered by a sheet. And he could only see, let's get back.
To me, one of the most amazing things, speaking as a physician myself, is that a little Army ward boys talk to captain into giving a shot of adrenaline directly into the heart. Y'all wouldn't necessarily know this, but in case my heart suddenly stopped, shot, lost blood that could be replaced, this was before the day of either closed or cardiac massage. That would have been the treatment's choice. But I later was to find out that the diagnosis was double lobar pneumonia. It's hard for you all possibly to realize this today because you live in the day of antibiotics. But even as late as 1945, at the end of World War II, 1 out of every 2 people who entered the medical college of Virginia with nobody known to die was a great killer. Still, you're a great killer of old age. But with antibiotics today, we certainly use to not worry with it. Now, I tell you that from a subjective point of view. I mean, from a physical point of view. From a subjective point of view, this is what I experienced. I awakened, but found myself in this little room. I'd never been in this room before. I'm looking around the room trying to find my uniform because I realized that I had missed my train. Now, let me say that this sounds intuitive. It's not quite as intuitive as it sounds. How many of you have ever set your clock to get up and go hunting or fishing and found yourself wake up just before the alarm clock went off? Many of you have ever been mothers, and I don't think y'all do it anymore, but when I used to be family physician, we had the mothers feed the babies every 4 hours whether they were hungry or not. I think it was part of a sadistic trend. As many a time I've seen my wife wake up just before the alarm clock went off, whether the baby alarm clock went off or not. Because we do. We have a built-in time system in us that is accurate down to well within a second. And I knew intuitively I had missed my train. Let me kind of give you a picture of what this room looked like. If you went from the door out to where this room here is sitting, and back over to about here, and then back here, imagine a white hospital bed here, a white bedside table here, a lamp right here with a 15-watt light bulb, the big lamp was turned off. That day time, they didn't have the screens like we have now in the hospital where you can pull around the ceiling. What they pulled those things, they want the screen in the bed, it was on an iron frame, kind of a white sheet on the iron frame, they pulled it around the front. Over here was a door going to a connecting bath. Right here was a white shack. That was the only thing you know. And I'm looking for my uniform because I think I've got to get to medical school right quick. Couldn't find it. I said, well, I didn't have time enough to remain in that place. I was going to leave there anyway. So I come on out of the room, go into the ward, because this was a room apparently set between another room like it is, another room here. Across from me was the nurse's office, over here was the ward boy office, and the storage room over here on this side was the doctor's office. Back here were double doors going to a ward that had 12 beds on each side. Here double doors going out into a connecting ramp that connected all these wards together. So I go on through the doors going into the connecting corridor, and I saw this ward boy coming down with a covered up tray. Now, whether it was medical instruments, food, what, I don't know. But I turned around to tell him to watch where he was going because he was going to walk to me. Neither he went through me or I through him. Now, you would have thought that this would have gotten over the very thing you heard Cooper Ross talk about passages now. At that age, when I got my mind made up I was going to do something, I was going to do it. So there's the door right across the corridor going to that door, so I go through that door. I'm no sooner through that door than me. I'm about 500 feet to 500 yards above the ground, traveling at the most incredible rate of speed you've ever seen in your life. See the topography gradually changing from the mesquite trees and the little sand dunes there, the panhandle of Texas, to where it's getting more and more like I was accustomed to. Past many small roads, finally past this large road. Saw this white all-night cafe on the corner. Decided I'd light down because I saw this lone civilian walking down the street getting ready to go into this cafe to see if he could tell me how to get whether I was on the right road to get to Richmond. Man, you got to bet I'm either heard about a tree or this is too fantastic to be they had left back there.
Okay. Like I was mentioning later, he's recounting his experience right now. The thing that's confusing me, Dr. Ritchie, when you first left your body behind, did you see your hair and face as recorded in this book right here? I ask this because of this. In your book that you wrote, Order to Return, My Life After Dying. You write this. I'll start reading on this part. I went over to lean against the guy wire, the cable coming from the telephone pole, and my hand went through it, as you heard it say just in the video. This is too much. Wait a minute. I suddenly thought, what has happened to me? No one can see me or hear me. Is this a coincidence that I have bumped into two men? With the trouble, if the wardman and the man cannot hear or see me, will mother be able to see or hear me? Will the commandant or any of the professors or students be able to know I'm there? What is the use of going on if they cannot? I have never had to face any problem like this. If I don't continue going on where I'm going, wherever that may be, then do I go back? If I do, why and to what? The hospital wardman couldn't see me either. What was that covered mound? I left the bed after I stood up back in the room in Texas. Could that have been a body? What was that covered mound? Covered with a sheet? So that means, according to this book, George Ritchie's near-death experience was probably just a momentary flash in the mind that happened in less than a second. But his brain, when he came back, translated it into a linear experience when it was really just a one flash in the pan. What was that covered mound? So he was not truly dead for 9 minutes. That shook my faith to this man's near-death experience. Makes me believe not believe it's a true makes me not believe in it.
But whatever that thing was, because I was still using massive knowledge, it has apparently changed my appearance. So neither the ward boy nor this guy could see me. And the next question that hit me, well, what would be the point of going on to Ritchie?
Dr. Ritchie, I have one question. When you first came out of your body, was it covered with a sheet? Or could you see your face and hair? And then when you came back, was it... And when you came back, of course, it was covered with a sheet. But the first time you saw it, Dr. Ritchie, was your body covered with a sheet? Or could you see your face and hair?
Even if I was going in the right direction. Because the ward boy hadn't seen me, this man hadn't seen me. Would the commandant be able to see me? Would my family be able to see me when I got there? And I was rapidly coming to the conclusion, for some very strange reason, no. Now let me stop at this stage and say this. Approximately, I guess because this was December, probably the night, the early morning of December the 20th of 1943. In October of 1944, because I conditioned at a medical school, I and four of the medical students were reassigned back to Abilene, Texas, in Rockland, Texas. We got a week's delay in travel. We wanted to go by and see New Orleans. First night we spent in Cincinnati, Ohio, coming from Richmond to Cincinnati. Second night we decided we were going to spend in Vicksburg, Mississippi. Third night, fourth night, and fifth night in New Orleans. Then on over to Dallas, spend the night there. Then Fort Worth, and way home down in Texas. We pulled into Vicksburg after dark. This was wintertime, October. Land this motel, got up early the next morning because we were trying to get down to New Orleans as quick as we could. None of us had seen it. We all heard about as much about New Orleans, I guess, as any of y'all here. And we were driving down this street, and we had to turn up to get Equals Bridge, because if any of you've ever been in Vicksburg, you go across over to Louisiana, but it's very high over on the Vicksburg side. And I said to the medical student driving, I said, would you mind going down one block farther? He said, why? Now this time I had, for many reasons, already learned not to tell anybody about this express I had, because everybody kept looking at me like I was a bit sad. I said, don't ask me why, I just want to see if there's a white all-night cafe on the corner. We went one block farther, and there was the same white all-night cafe I'm telling you about right now. I had never been in Vicksburg in human form before. So this takes, you see, this out of any possibility of any illusion, hallucination, or dream. Now, suddenly was to make a great discovery, because by this time I'm getting a little bit frank. Somehow I intuitively knew I had better go back, and I'm coming now back to the experience I was telling you, to Camp Barkley Station Hospital. And when I passed the dial was breaking down, I began to realize I had left the body in that bed. I couldn't truly account for it because I had a spiritual body, a spiritual being. And I had no trouble getting there. Now that's very definitely incredulous, I'm sure, for you to understand what I'm saying. I want to say something to you. William James was absolutely right when he talked about this type of experience being totally inhabitable. I happen to use a language that there is no language to actually describe what I experienced. So the only thing I can do is try to translate it to words that you can get some concept of.
Is that why the details of your story don't match?
And I'm sure there's a gap. But time and space that you and I comprehended in this dimension does not exist once you get out of this dimension. And no trouble at all getting back there because of current. In our spiritual form, we have a homing device correct and independent. If you look at your map and look at Abilene, Texas, Richmond, Virginia, and Vicksburg, Mississippi, you'll find out just about on a straight course that you could have possibly been on. That's a profile I got.
Well, how come you can find your way immediately back to Camp Barkley, but couldn't go straight back to your body then? Why do you have to search through the wards to try to find your body, if that's be true?
But you see, when I left that room, I hadn't looked to see what room it was. I hadn't looked to see which ward it was. And when I got back there to the station hospital, I started on the strangest search you can imagine. And I'm sure that most of you young people have heard about an identity crisis. But I've got a new definition of identity crisis. You think you know what you look like? Forget it. You've never seen yourself except in the two-dimensional object known as a mirror from here up. You can go over here to Melrose, maybe look there where you've got your glass in three directions where you can get some idea inside. But just out of curiosity, how many of you ever heard yourself for the first time on a tape recorder or saw yourself on television were a little shocked at what you look like? You have some idea what I was faced with. Now I'm going from ward to ward, room to room. I can see the soldiers lying Persinger on the side. 1945, the year I was due to graduate, I've been on the schedule. And I'm going through trying to find these bodies lying in the bed that have this ring on. I see several people that look like me. But those that had the handler didn't have my fraternity ring on. Now I'm getting more and more desperate because I can see these beings, these soldiers, these nurses, these ward boys, these doctors, but I cannot contact them. Quite obviously they can neither hear nor see me. And finally, after what seemed to me an interminable amount of time, I went into this little room and saw this corpse lying in the bed. I gathered it was a corpse because the sheet had been pulled up over his head. And I didn't like what I saw, because when they pulled the sheet up over their head, they left this part of the lower arm, wrist, and hand. And on the finger was my Phi-Gamma fraternity ring, wasn't any way of mixing it up. Because it was the Phi-Gamma seal on the black onyx in the University of Richmond State. And you don't have one made up like that very often. Not only that, the onyx was chipped, like chipped. And what distressed me, the color of that hand had the exact same color that I'd seen my grandfather's hand have when he had expired 3 years before. And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. You're dead. But you see, I wasn't prepared for this. I have been raised strict all through like fundamental facts. The concept that when you died, you either went to heaven or went to hell. This wasn't heaven, and this certainly wasn't hell. I had vaguely heard about purgatory.